The radio crackled with the voices of dying men. Seraphina pressed her back against the cold stone wall of the tribunal chamber, listening as the dispatch officer read casualty reports in a voice stripped of emotion by years of war. 3rd Battalion, 70% losses. 5th Regiment, requesting immediate evacuation. Supply Convoy Delta, no survivors. Each announcement landed like a hammer blow against the collective consciousness of the assembled pack, but no one flinched anymore. 20 years of civil war had taught them all to keep their faces like stone. Elder Matthias Ashford stood at the center of the chamber, his silver-streaked hair catching the weak winter light that filtered through the high windows. He was 65 years old, though he carried himself like a man half that age, his back straight despite the weight of command that had bent so many others. The medals on his chest told stories of battles won and comrades lost, each piece of metal a small monument to sacrifice. He had been a major once, back when the territories were whole. Now he was simply elder, the last authority in a pack that was slowly bleeding to death. Sarah watched him avoid her eyes. The fitness evaluation had been scheduled for weeks, but everyone in the Grey March remnant knew what it really was: a culling. Resources were finite, and winter was coming hard on the heels of autumn. Those who could not contribute to the war effort would be released, a polite military euphemism that meant exile into territories where rogues and enemy patrols hunted with equal hunger. The evaluation was mercy of a sort, a formal acknowledgement that some deaths could be delayed, if not prevented. 42 pack members had been evaluated that morning. 39 had passed. Sarah stood with the other 2 failures in the cold light of judgment, feeling the weight of every gaze upon her. She understood the logic. War demanded hard choices, and sentiment was a luxury they could no longer afford. Her grandmother had explained it to her 6 months ago, in the final weeks before the pneumonia took her. "You are brilliant, child," Elara had whispered, her breath rattling in lungs that had breathed battlefield smoke too many times. But brilliance means nothing if you cannot prove it. In war, perception becomes reality. Show them what you can do, or they will see only what you cannot. But Sarah could not shift. Or rather, she could shift, but only partially, her body trapped in an agonizing halfway point between human and wolf that served no tactical purpose anyone could identify. For 20 minutes that morning, she had stood before the evaluation committee and tried to force her bones to reshape themselves fully, tried to will her consciousness into the pure animal state that came so naturally to everyone else. Instead, she had managed only patchy golden fur along her forearms, claws that extended from fingers that remained stubbornly human, a face that elongated into something almost lupine, but retained too much humanity to be effective. The committee had watched in silence, their pity worse than any contempt. Elder Matthias cleared his throat, the sound echoing in the sudden quiet as the radio dispatch finally ended. The 2 other failures had already been dismissed, given 72 hours to gather their possessions and depart. Now only Sarah remained, and the elder finally met her gaze with eyes that held depths of sorrow she could not begin to parse. "I am sorry, child," he said, and his voice carried the weight of genuine regret. "Your grandmother was one of the finest field medics I ever served with. She saved my life twice and the lives of countless others. I know she taught you her skills, and in another time, in another world, those skills would make you invaluable to this pack." "But this is not another time," Sarah replied quietly, saving him the necessity of saying it. Matthias nodded slowly. "War demands we conserve resources for those who can fight. You understand this. I can see in your eyes that you understand." "I do," she said, and meant it. Understanding and accepting were different things, but she had learned early that survival often required swallowing bitter truths. "My grandmother taught me that hard choices are still choices. You are choosing your pack's survival. I respect that." Something flickered across the elder's weathered face, an emotion too complex to name. 72 hours, he said formally, his voice carrying to every witness in the chamber. "You will be provided with basic supplies, as is customary. Medical kit, rations for 3 days, cold weather gear. No one in this pack wishes you harm, Seraphina. We simply cannot afford to keep those who cannot contribute to our defense." Sarah nodded once, sharply, a gesture she had learned from watching career soldiers accept orders they disagreed with but would follow nonetheless. "Understood, Elder. Thank you for the supplies." She turned to leave, moving through the ranks of assembled pack members who parted before her like water. Some faces held sympathy, others held relief that they had not been chosen. A few, the youngest ones who had known only war, held a contempt born of ignorance, their eyes saying what their mouths did not: defective, useless, dead weight. But Sarah kept her chin high and her shoulders straight, channeling every lesson her grandmother had drilled into her about dignity in defeat. Elara had been a military psychologist before she became a field medic, skilled in the arts of reading human nature and maintaining morale when hope seemed lost. She had taught Sarah that surrender and defeat were different things, that sometimes the most powerful act was choosing how you would fall. The door closed behind her with a sound like the sealing of a tomb. 72 hours later, Sarah found herself deep in territories she had never traveled, following game trails that wound through forests thick with pine and shadow. The winter storm had been building for days, visible as a dark wall on the northern horizon, and now it was upon her with the fury of something alive and malicious. Rain fell like needles of ice, each drop a small violence against her exposed skin. The cold weather gear Matthias had provided was military-grade and well-made, but it could only do so much against the kind of weather that turned the landscape into an enemy as dangerous as any patrol. She should have been terrified. Perhaps she was, underneath the strange calm that had settled over her like a blanket. But fear seemed like a luxury she could not afford, so instead she focused on the practical necessities of survival. Find shelter, conserve energy, stay dry if possible, stay warm if not. Her grandmother's voice lived in her memory, patient and steady, walking her through the protocols of field survival that Elara had learned over 30 years of military service. High ground offers visibility but exposure, the remembered voice instructed. Low ground offers concealment but flood risk during storms. Compromise by finding elevated positions near natural drainage. Caves are ideal if you can confirm they are unoccupied. Never shelter in places that trap you without multiple exits. Sarah moved through the forest like a ghost, her small frame sliding between trees and under low branches with an efficiency born of necessity. Being slight had its advantages in wilderness survival, requiring less food and water, generating less noise, fitting into spaces larger bodies could not navigate. The pack had seen her size as weakness, but her grandmother had taught her to recognize it as tactical flexibility. The smell hit her before she saw the cave. Wolf, strong and sharp, the musk of multiple animals in an enclosed space. Sarah froze mid-step, every muscle tensing as her inadequate survival instincts screamed conflicting messages. Run, hide, investigate. She was not a wolf, not fully, but some part of her animal nature recognized the scent as both danger and potential kinship. These were not her pack, not anymore, but they were her kind in some fundamental way that transcended pack politics. The cave entrance was half hidden behind a fallen log and a tangle of dead vines, nature's camouflage making it nearly invisible to casual observation. Military training would have taught scouts to mark such locations, to use natural concealment as strategic advantage. The fact that someone or something had chosen this cave meant they understood terrain the same way Sarah did. She crept closer, moving with the careful deliberation of someone who knew that speed could get you killed faster than caution. Her hands shook, whether from cold or fear she could not say. The wind howled through the trees like a wounded animal, branches creaking and groaning as they bent beneath the storm's assault. Thunder cracked somewhere in the distance, a sound like artillery fire, and Sarah flinched despite herself. The cave mouth exhaled a breath of warmer air, carrying with it the complex scent signature of at least 3 distinct wolves. But underneath the musk was something else, something that made Sarah's barely functional instincts sit up and take notice. Blood, old sweat, infection. These were not healthy animals at the peak of their strength. These were wounded soldiers trying to survive, just like her. The decision made itself. Sarah slipped through the narrow entrance, her body fitting easily through the gap that would have challenged larger wolves. Inside, the darkness was absolute for several heartbeats, until her eyes adjusted to reveal the cave's interior. It was smaller than she had hoped, but larger than she had feared, roughly circular with a ceiling high enough to stand upright if she stayed near the center. And there, huddled together for warmth in the deepest shadows, 3 wolves watched her with eyes that glowed like amber coals in the darkness. The largest, a gray male with a scar bisecting his muzzle, raised his head and growled low in his chest. The sound rumbled through the enclosed space like distant thunder, a warning that needed no translation. "Come closer and die." But even as he growled, Sarah could see the way his ribs showed beneath his matted fur, the way his breathing came shallow and pained. The wound in his side was poorly healed, the flesh around it inflamed and weeping. Infection. Without treatment, he would be dead within days. The second wolf, darker and younger with a distinctive patch over one eye, had not even lifted his head. He lay motionless except for the slight rise and fall of his chest, conserving every ounce of energy for the simple act of continued breathing. His left foreleg was swollen to twice its normal size, the paw bent at an angle that spoke of breaks that had set poorly or not at all. The third wolf, a tawny female, watched Sarah with eyes that held more intelligence than desperation. She was the healthiest of the 3, though that was relative when all 3 were clearly starving. Her gaze tracked Sarah's every movement with the focused attention of a tactician assessing a potential threat or asset. Sarah slowly lowered herself to sit just inside the entrance, making herself as small and non-threatening as possible. Her pack, her former pack, would have called this moment suicide. Walking into a cave of hungry predators with no ability to defend herself if they chose to attack. But something in her grandmother's teachings whispered that these were not predators in that moment. They were soldiers far from home, wounded and abandoned, facing death with the same grim resignation she had felt in the tribunal chamber. "I have nothing," she said quietly, her voice barely audible above the storm that raged outside. "But I can share what little there is." She removed her pack with slow, deliberate movements, giving them time to process her intentions and react if they chose. Inside were the medical supplies Matthias had provided, along with 3 days' worth of field rations and the tools she had managed to gather during her 72-hour exodus. Water purification tablets, emergency blankets, a small folding knife, basic first aid supplies that seemed pathetically inadequate for the injuries she was looking at. And food, not much, but enough. Sarah spread the rations on the cave floor before her, dividing them with careful precision. The protein bars that tasted like cardboard but provided essential calories. The dried fruit that her grandmother had taught her to forage and preserve. The jerky that was supposed to last her 3 days but would barely make 1 meal for 3 starving wolves. She pushed the food forward, sliding it across the stone floor toward the watching wolves, then retreated to give them space. "It is not enough," she continued, still speaking in that same quiet voice. "I know it is not enough, but it is everything I have and you need it more than I do." The gray wolf watched her for a long moment, his growl fading into silence. Intelligence moved behind those amber eyes, a calculating assessment that went beyond animal instinct. Sarah recognized that look. She had seen it in the eyes of career soldiers, men and women who had learned to read situations quickly and make decisions that meant the difference between survival and death. The tawny female moved first, creeping forward with her belly low to the ground, approaching the food with the wariness of someone who had learned that gifts often came with strings attached. She sniffed the protein bar carefully, then looked back at Sarah, as if asking permission or checking for signs of deception. "It is safe," Sarah said. "No poison, no tricks, just food." The female took the bar delicately between her teeth and retreated to the darker recesses of the cave. The gray male watched this entire exchange, then made his own decision. He rose with visible effort, pain etching lines into his posture, and approached the remaining food. He did not eat immediately. Instead, he picked up the jerky and carried it to the youngest wolf, the one with the broken leg who had not moved. Only after ensuring his packmate had food did the gray return for his own share. Sarah felt something tighten in her chest. Pack loyalty. Even starving, even wounded and abandoned in hostile territory, these wolves maintained their hierarchy and cared for their weakest member first. It was the kind of loyalty that had been drilled into every soldier during basic training, the ethos that you never left anyone behind, even when retreat was the only logical option. The storm intensified outside, wind screaming through the forest like a living thing. Sarah pulled her knees to her chest and wrapped her arms around them, conserving heat as the temperature dropped. She had given away her food, which meant she would be hungrier tomorrow, but the calculation seemed sound. 3 allies, even wounded ones, were better than dying alone. The tawny female finished her food and approached again, moving with more confidence now. She came close enough that Sarah could see the individual hairs of her coat, the old scars that marked her as a veteran of multiple engagements, the way her muscles bunched and released beneath the matted fur. Then, with a deliberation that felt almost ceremonial, the wolf lay down beside Sarah and pressed her warm body against the human's side. "You are welcome," Sarah whispered, daring to place one trembling hand on the wolf's coarse fur. The gray male watched this interaction with those unnervingly intelligent eyes. Something shifted in his gaze, some internal calculation being revised. He finished his own food, then settled near the cave entrance in a position that blocked the opening and shielded the others from the wind. His body formed a living barrier, a soldier taking watch so his companions could rest. Sarah understood that she was being protected. Sleep came in waves, dragging her under despite her best efforts to remain alert. The warmth of the wolf beside her was better than any blanket. The steady rhythm of the animal's breathing, a comfort she had not known she needed. Her dreams were fragmented things, images of running through forests she had never seen, hunting prey she could not name, and always, always the presence of other wolves around her. Pack. The word tasted different in her dreams, less like a political unit and more like family. She woke to silence. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world transformed by ice and snow. Pale morning light filtered through the cave entrance, painting everything in shades of gray and white. The wolves were gone, leaving only paw prints in the soft earth and the lingering scent of wild things. For a moment, Sarah felt a profound sense of loss, as if she had been on the verge of understanding something important and had it snatched away. Then she noticed the markings. They were subtle, easy to miss if you did not know what to look for. 3 stones arranged in a pattern near the cave entrance, the universal military signal for gratitude between soldiers who could not risk direct communication. "Thank you." Message received. Debt acknowledged. Sarah gathered her depleted supplies, shouldering her pack with the efficiency of practice. She had 1 day of rations left, maybe 2 if she stretched them. Water would be easier to find now that the storm had passed, though she would need to be careful about purification. Her trajectory had been vaguely south, away from Grey March territories, and toward the neutral zones where civilian settlements sometimes offered work to those desperate enough to accept it. She stepped out of the cave into the transformed landscape and froze. Tracks, massive tracks, far larger than any wolf should make, circled the cave entrance in a careful perimeter. The spacing was deliberate, the depth consistent, the pattern that of a patrol sweep conducted by someone with military training. These were not the marks of a wild animal hunting for prey. These were the tracks of a commander checking his territory, ensuring his borders were secure. Sarah's inadequate instincts finally caught up with her understanding, and ice that had nothing to do with the weather settled in her stomach. The Northern Command. She had wandered into territories controlled by General Thorne Blackridge, the man whose name was spoken in whispers, whose reputation preceded him like a shockwave. He was legend and nightmare combined, the commander who had never lost a strategic engagement, who had held the Northern Territories against impossible odds for 15 years. He was also the man who reportedly executed deserters personally and accepted surrender only when it came with total submission. And he had been here, watching, evaluating. Sarah knew she should run. Everything in her screamed to move, to get as far from this place as possible before the general or his soldiers returned. But her legs would not obey, locked in place by some combination of exhaustion and fatalism. She had nowhere left to run to. The neutral territories were weeks away on foot, through regions crawling with coalition patrols and rogue bands. Grey March would not take her back even if she wanted to return. The Northern Command was, in some perverse way, her best option for survival. The forest around her went silent. No birds sang. No small animals rustled in the undergrowth. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something to happen. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she slowly turned, scanning the tree line for movement, for any sign of the presence that had turned the world into a held breath. He emerged from between two ancient pines like something conjured from shadow and legend. General Thorne Blackridge was not what she had expected. The stories painted him as a monster, 7 feet of scar tissue and rage wrapped in military discipline. The reality was somehow more intimidating. He stood perhaps 6'3", his frame lean and hard from years of campaign living. His black hair was shot through with silver at the temples, worn longer than regulation in a style that suggested he no longer had to follow anyone's rules but his own. His face was all sharp angles and harder edges, the map of his jaw marked by a scar that ran from left ear to chin, the souvenir of some battle he had survived when others had not. But it was his eyes that held her paralyzed. They were the color of winter ice, pale blue verging on gray, and they assessed her with the focused attention of a predator evaluating prey. He wore combat fatigues that had seen hard use, the fabric faded and patched but clean and well-maintained. His gear was minimal but professional, a tactical vest with ammunition pouches and medical supplies, boots that had carried him through more kilometers than most people would travel in a lifetime. No decorations, no insignia beyond the simple bars that marked his rank. Everything about him screamed competence and danger in equal measure. "Report," he said, and his voice was exactly what Sarah had imagined, deep and cold, carrying the absolute expectation of obedience that came from years of command. "What happened here, civilian?" The question was phrased as an order, and Sarah found herself responding before conscious thought could intervene. 3 wounded soldiers, sir. In the cave. I provided medical assessment and shared my rations." Thorne moved closer, his steps silent despite his size, a ghost in military boots. His eyes never left her face, reading micro-expressions with the skill of someone trained in interrogation techniques. "You treated enemy combatants," he said, making it a statement rather than a question. "I treated wounded soldiers," Sarah replied, forcing her voice to remain steady despite the fear that clawed at her throat. "I saw no enemies, only people who needed help." Something flickered across Thorne's face, too fast to identify. Surprise, perhaps, or reassessment. He circled her slowly, maintaining distance but controlling the space, forcing her to turn to keep him in view. "You understand military protocols," he observed. "Geneva Convention rules of engagement. Non-combatants providing aid to wounded soldiers, regardless of faction affiliation." "My grandmother served as a field medic in the partition wars," Sarah said, lifting her chin to meet his gaze directly. "She taught me that leaving soldiers to die is not survival. It is desertion of the most fundamental duty we owe each other." Thorne stopped his circuit, standing directly before her now, close enough that she could see the way his pupils dilated slightly as he processed her words. "Your grandmother," he repeated. "Would that be Alara Ashford? Field psychologist and combat medic, attached to the 3rd Medical Battalion during the Southern campaigns?" Sarah's breath caught. "Yes, sir. Did you know her?" "She saved my life," Thorne said flatly, offering the information without embellishment. 17 years ago, during the siege of Iron Pass. Mortar fragment in my chest, 3 inches from my heart. She kept me alive for 6 hours while we waited for evacuation." He paused, and something almost like warmth entered his cold voice. "She was one of the finest soldiers I ever served with. Her death is a loss the territories can ill afford." "Thank you, sir," Sarah managed, struggling to process this revelation. Grandmother had never mentioned saving the life of the man who would become the North's most feared commander. Thorne resumed his assessment, his gaze traveling over her small frame with clinical precision. "You cannot shift properly," he said, making it neither question nor accusation. "You are Omega caste in a pack that has expelled you. You are alone in hostile territory with minimal supplies and no clear destination." He tilted his head slightly, a gesture that somehow made him seem more predatory. "And yet you risked your own survival to help 3 wolves who could have killed you. Why?" "Because they were hungry," Sarah said simply, the truth easier than any elaborate justification. "I know what that feels like, sir. I know what it is like when no one wants you." Silence stretched between them, measured in heartbeats that seemed too loud in the frozen stillness. Thorne studied her with an intensity that felt like being dissected, every weakness and strength catalogued for future reference. Then his expression shifted, the hard lines softening fractionally into something that might have been respect. "Those 3 soldiers were operating under my direct orders," he said, his voice losing some of its edge. "A loyalty test for Border Patrol personnel. They were instructed to refuse all aid, to report any territorial pack members who offered assistance. It is a test that has identified 17 security breaches in the past year." He paused, letting that information settle. "You are the first civilian to pass." Sarah felt the ground shift beneath her feet, reality reorganizing itself around this new information. The wolves had not been wounded at all, or perhaps they had been, but the test had been real nonetheless. She had walked into a military operation without knowing it, and had somehow done exactly the right thing. "Come with me," Thorne said, and it was not a request. "The Northern Command needs personnel who can think independently while maintaining protocol discipline. We need medics who understand both the science and the ethics of battlefield medicine. And most importantly," he added, something dangerous glinting in his ice-colored eyes, "we need people who will do the right thing even when it costs them everything." "Sir," Sarah said carefully, choosing her words with the precision of someone who understood she was negotiating for her survival. "I appreciate the offer, but I must be honest. I am Omega Caste. I cannot shift properly. I can offer medical skills and field knowledge, but I cannot fight in wolf form. What possible value could I bring to a military operation?" Thorne's smile was sharp enough to cut. "That," he said quietly, "is precisely what I need to show you." He turned and walked toward the tree line where other figures now emerged from concealment. Soldiers, 5 of them, moving with the synchronized precision of a unit that had trained together for years. They formed a loose perimeter around Sarah, not threatening but clearly containing professional courtesy, masking the reality that refusal was not actually an option. A woman approached from the group, her movements economical and confident. She was perhaps 32, lean and wiry with short dark hair and a scar bisecting her left eyebrow. Her eyes held the flat affect of someone who had seen too much combat and learned to process it by feeling less. The bars on her collar marked her as a colonel, second only to Thorne himself in the command hierarchy. "Colonel Cade Ironwood," Thorne introduced, "my chief tactical officer and the finest combat strategist in the Northern Territories. Cade, this is Seraphina, Ilara's granddaughter." Cade's eyes widened fractionally, the only sign of surprise she allowed herself. "Ilara Ashford trained you?" she asked, her voice carrying a note of something that might have been respect. "Yes, ma'am," Sarah replied, recognizing another career soldier when she saw one. "Then you already know more about field medicine than half my combat medics," Cade said. She looked to Thorne. "You are bringing her to command?" "I am," Thorne confirmed. "Prepare transport. I want us at headquarters before nightfall." Within minutes, Sarah found herself in the back of a military transport vehicle, a utilitarian affair with bench seating and canvas sides that did nothing to keep out the cold. But it was warmer than walking, and the other passengers included 2 female soldiers who offered her a thermal blanket and a canteen of hot tea without being asked. Small mercies that felt enormous after 3 days of barely surviving. "We heard about Greymarch culling their Omegas," one of the soldiers said quietly. She was young, maybe 20, with the accent of the Western Territories. "I am sorry that happened to you." Sarah accepted the tea gratefully. "Thank you. It was a practical decision. Resources are limited everywhere." "Still shit," the other soldier muttered. She was older, perhaps 30, with scars that suggested extensive combat experience. "Name's Corporal Mira Stone, that is Private Lena Cross. Do not mind us. We are just escort detail." The journey took most of the day, the vehicle following roads that had been maintained by military engineering crews. Sarah watched the landscape transform from wilderness to something more structured, cleared fields marking the boundaries of settlements, guard posts at regular intervals, the visible infrastructure of an organized command structure. This was not the chaos of disputed territories or the desperate clinging to survival that characterized Greymarch Remnant. This was military order imposed on the wilderness, civilization carved out of hostile terrain through discipline and strategy. They stopped once for a meal break, and Thorne appeared beside the transport without warning, materializing from wherever commanders went when they were not actively commanding. He carried 2 field rations and offered one to Sarah without preamble. "Eat," he instructed. "You will need your strength." Sarah accepted the ration, trying not to let her hunger show as she opened the packaging. The food was military standard, designed for calories and preservation rather than taste, but it was warm and plentiful. She ate slowly, making herself chew thoroughly despite the urge to devour everything immediately. Thorne sat on the transport's running board, his own food barely touched. "You asked what value you could bring," he said without looking at her. "Let me answer that question properly. The Northern Command is not losing this war, but we are not winning it either. We have held our territories for 15 years through superior tactics and disciplined logistics. But wars are not won through defense alone. They are won through adaptation." He finally looked at her, and the intensity in his gaze made her breath catch. "You demonstrated something in that cave that most of my soldiers cannot do. You assessed a situation without complete information, made a tactical decision based on incomplete data, and acted with both strategic thinking and ethical consideration. You saw wounded soldiers, not enemy combatants. You prioritized humanitarian aid over self-preservation. And you did it all while maintaining operational security and protocol discipline." Sarah processed this, recognizing the compliment buried in the analysis. "You are saying my inability to shift is irrelevant to my value as a soldier." "I am saying," Thorne corrected, "that your inability to shift may actually be an advantage in the kind of warfare we now face. But I cannot explain further until we reach command headquarters and I can access classified materials. For now, I need you to trust that I am not recruiting you as charity. I am recruiting you because you may be exactly what this war needs." That night they reached the Northern Command headquarters, and Sarah understood for the first time the true scale of Thorne's operation. This was not a simple military outpost. This was a fortress compound covering several square kilometers, surrounded by walls 20 feet high and topped with observation towers at regular intervals. Inside the walls, organized chaos ruled. Barracks buildings stood in neat rows. Training grounds stretched in multiple directions, soldiers drilling even as darkness fell. Vehicle yards held everything from transport trucks to armored personnel carriers. A field hospital flew the Red Cross on white background that marked it as protected under the Geneva Convention. This was not just a military base. This was the foundation of a functioning society, complete with civilian quarters where families lived in relative safety, markets where goods were traded, schools where children learned. The Northern Command had become a city-state unto itself, self-sufficient and defensible, a bubble of order in a world that had forgotten what peace looked like. Thorne led her through the organized chaos with the confidence of someone who knew every meter of his domain. Soldiers saluted as they passed, but the general did not return the gestures, too focused on his destination. They stopped before a building larger than the others, built from concrete and steel rather than wood, with security checkpoints at every entrance, command headquarters. Inside, the atmosphere shifted from military functionality to something more akin to a corporate office, though the people working at desks wore combat fatigues instead of business suits. Thorne guided her through a maze of corridors to an office that was spare to the point of asceticism. A desk with 3 computer monitors, filing cabinets that probably held classified documents, a wall of maps marked with tactical positions and supply routes, and books, dozens of them, lined up on shelves with military precision. "Sit," Thorne said, gesturing to the single chair that faced his desk. Sarah sat, her exhaustion finally catching up with her now that immediate survival was no longer the pressing concern. She watched as Thorne moved to one of the filing cabinets and unlocked it with a key he wore on a chain around his neck. He withdrew a folder, worn with age and marked with classification stamps, and placed it on the desk between them. "What I am about to tell you is classified at the highest level," he began, his voice dropping into the formal cadence of a briefing. "Information that fewer than 20 people in all the territories have access to. You will not repeat anything you hear in this room. You will not discuss it with anyone, including other command personnel, without my direct authorization. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir," Sarah replied, her heart beginning to pound with something that was equal parts fear and anticipation. Thorne opened the folder, revealing documents that looked decades old, the paper yellowed with age. Before the Civil War, before the partition, before the territories fragmented into the chaos we now inhabit, there was a military research program called the Halfling Protocol. It was designed to create special operations soldiers who could operate behind enemy lines with maximum effectiveness by combining human intelligence with wolf sensory capabilities. He slid a photograph across the desk. It showed a soldier in partial shift, the halfway state that Sarah knew too well. But unlike her own painful transformation, this soldier looked comfortable, controlled, their expression focused rather than agonized. Halflings, Thorne continued, were not mistakes or defects. They were engineered advantages. The ability to maintain human cognitive function while accessing wolf senses meant these soldiers could plan strategy, operate complex equipment, and communicate verbally while retaining all the physical advantages of the wolf form. Enhanced hearing to detect approaching enemies, improved night vision for covert operations, heightened sense of smell for tracking and identification, all while maintaining the ability to use weapons, read maps, and make tactical decisions in real time. Sarah stared at the photograph, her mind racing. But the Civil War, she began. The protocol was destroyed. Everyone knows that the purists won and eliminated all research into hybrid states. Thorne's smile was grim. The protocol was officially discontinued, yes. The research facilities were destroyed, the scientists scattered or killed, the documentation burned. But genetic markers do not simply disappear. They persist across generations, dormant in bloodlines, waiting for the right combination of factors to activate. He leaned forward, his ice-blue eyes locking with hers. Your grandmother was one of the original protocol researchers. She worked in the medical division, studying the physiological impacts of sustained partial shift. When the program was shut down, she went into hiding, changed her name, and spent the rest of her life trying to protect the research she believed in. The world tilted beneath Sarah's feet. "My inability to shift," she whispered. "It is not a defect at all. It is a gift your grandmother tried desperately to suppress until you were old enough to understand its value," Thorne confirmed. "She gave you medication to inhibit the transformation, hiding you from recruiters who would have recognized the markers. When she knew she was dying, she stopped the suppressants, allowing your natural abilities to begin emerging." He paused, letting the weight of revelation settle. "She died knowing that someone would find you eventually. She hoped it would be me." The folder contained more documents, more photographs, detailed medical assessments and psychological profiles of soldiers who had undergone protocol training. Sarah read through them with growing understanding, seeing in their recorded experiences echoes of her own struggles. The pain of transformation that lessened with practice, the difficulty maintaining the halfway state that became easier with proper training. The sense of being caught between two worlds that could be transformed into the ability to navigate both with equal skill. "Why now?" Sarah finally asked, looking up from the documents. "Why tell me this now? Why not simply conscript me and force the training?" Thorne closed the folder carefully, his movements precise. "Because conscription creates soldiers who follow orders. I need someone who will question them." He met her gaze steadily. 17 years ago, your grandmother saved my life. But more importantly, she changed how I thought about warfare. She taught me that the strongest armies are not built on forced compliance but on voluntary commitment to a cause worth dying for. He stood and moved to the wall of maps, his finger tracing supply routes and defensive positions. This war is a stalemate because both sides are fighting the last war, using tactics that were obsolete 50 years ago. Massive frontal assaults, territorial control through force projection, supply line interdiction. We are going through the motions of conflict without adapting to the reality that has changed around us. He turned back to her. The Halfling protocol was not designed for conventional warfare. It was designed for asymmetric conflict, for operations where flexibility and adaptability mattered more than raw power. "And you think I can learn these skills?" Sarah said, trying to keep the hope from her voice. "I know you can," Thorne replied. "Because you have already demonstrated the fundamental quality that made the original Halfling successful. You can think tactically while acting compassionately. You can follow protocol while questioning orders. You can maintain discipline while adapting to changing circumstances. These are not skills that can be taught. They are traits that exist at the core of who you are." He returned to his desk and opened a drawer, withdrawing a document that bore the Northern Command seal. "This is a training contract. 6 weeks intensive instruction in combat tactics, field medicine, intelligence gathering, and most importantly, controlled transformation protocols. If you succeed, you will be commissioned as a lieutenant in the Special Operations Division. If you fail, you will receive honorable discharge and resettlement assistance to any civilian territory you choose." Sarah stared at the contract, her hand trembling as she reached for it. "Why?" she asked again, the question encompassing everything she could not articulate. Thorne was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice had lost its professional distance, becoming something raw and more human. My younger brother was killed 5 years ago in a supply convoy ambush. He was brilliant, an analyst who could predict enemy movements 3 steps ahead, but he could not shift at all due to a congenital condition. The pack leadership considered him useless despite his obvious talents. He died alone, defending a convoy that his commanding officer had decided was not worth reinforcing because Omega-caste soldiers were considered expendable. The general's jaw tightened, old grief etched into the lines of his face. I will not let another tactical genius be wasted because they are different. I will not let prejudice and outdated thinking cost us soldiers who could change the course of this war. And most importantly, he added, his eyes burning with quiet intensity, I will not dishonor your grandmother's memory by failing to see the value in what she spent her life protecting. Sarah picked up the pen that lay beside the contract. Her hand steadied as she signed her name, each letter a commitment to a future she had never imagined possible. When she looked up, Thorne was watching her with an expression she could not quite read. Welcome to the Northern Command, Lieutenant Seraphina, he said formally, but there was warmth in his cold voice now. Tomorrow morning, your training begins. Tonight, get some rest. You are going to need it. A knock at the door interrupted them. Come, Thorne called, and a woman entered, who seemed to carry authority in the set of her shoulders despite wearing civilian clothes. She was perhaps 55, with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that missed nothing. Magistrate Elara Frost, Thorne introduced. My seneschal and chief logistics officer. Elara, this is Lieutenant Seraphina. She will require quarters in the officer barracks and a full briefing on base protocols tomorrow morning. Elara's sharp gaze assessed Sarah in 3 seconds flat. Another of your special projects, General? She asked, and there was no judgment in her tone, only professional curiosity. The most important one yet, Thorne replied simply. Elara nodded as if this explained everything. Come with me, Lieutenant. I will show you to your quarters and ensure you have everything you need. Sarah followed the magistrate through the nighttime base, processing everything that had happened in the span of 12 hours. From exile to military commission, from defective Omega to potential special operations officer, from believing she was worthless to discovering she might be invaluable. It felt like whiplash, like falling upward instead of down. The officer barracks were simple but comfortable, each room containing a bed, desk, and private bathroom. Luxury compared to what she had known in Greymarch, where Omegas shared communal spaces and never had privacy. Elara provided her with uniforms, toiletries, and a schedule for the coming week that made Sarah's head spin with its intensity. The General has high hopes for you, Elara said as she prepared to leave. Do not disappoint him. He does not give second chances easily. But you think he is right about me? Sarah ventured, seeing something in the older woman's expression. Elara smiled, a small, knowing curve of lips. I think your grandmother was one of the most brilliant women I ever met, and she did not invest 22 years protecting you for no reason. Get some sleep, Lieutenant. Tomorrow you begin proving her right. Alone in her new quarters, Sarah sat on the edge of the bed and tried to process the impossible day. She thought of her grandmother, imagining Elara Ashford as a young scientist working on cutting-edge military research, hiding her discoveries when ideology turned violent, spending decades protecting a granddaughter she knew would one day be hunted for the very traits that made her special. Trust your instincts, Grandmother had whispered in those final weeks. They are stronger than you know. Sarah had thought she understood those words. Now she realized her grandmother had been preparing her for this moment, for the day when everything she thought she knew about herself would be revealed as carefully constructed protection rather than inherent limitation. Outside her window, the base continued its nocturnal operations, soldiers changing shifts, vehicles moving supplies, the complex machinery of military logistics grinding forward without pause. Somewhere in the command center, Thorne Blackridge was probably still working, reviewing intelligence reports and planning strategies that would determine the fates of thousands. And tomorrow, Sarah would begin learning to be more than she had ever imagined possible. She touched the simple metal pendant she wore around her neck, the last gift her grandmother had given her before death. It was nothing special, just a circle of silver with no ornamentation, but it had belonged to Elara since before the war. since before the protocol, since before everything changed. Trust your instincts. Sarah closed her eyes and reached for that place inside herself where the wolf waited, that halfway transformation she had always considered a curse. But this time, instead of fighting it, instead of trying to force it into completion or suppress it entirely, she simply allowed it to be. The sensation was familiar, but somehow different, less painful when she stopped resisting. For just a moment she held the state, feeling her senses sharpen, her hearing extending to catch the sound of boots on pavement 3 buildings away, her vision adjusting to see clearly in the darkness. Then she released it, returning to fully human form with a controlled ease that surprised her. This was what her grandmother had protected. Not a defect to be hidden, but a gift to be preserved until it could be properly trained. And General Thorne Blackridge, the man whose life Alara had saved 17 years ago, had spent those years preparing to honor the debt by ensuring that gift would not be wasted. Sarah lay back on the bed, exhaustion finally claiming her. Tomorrow would bring challenges she could barely imagine, but tonight, for the first time since her exile, she felt something that had been absent for so long she barely recognized it. Hope. And with hope came the possibility that everything she had lost might be only the beginning of what she would gain. The Northern Command was not her pack, not yet. General Thorne was not family, not in any conventional sense. But the contract she had signed was more than military conscription. It was a promise that her value would be measured by what she could become rather than what she had failed to be. It was recognition that strength came in many forms, and sometimes the greatest warriors were those who had learned to bridge the gaps between impossible things. Outside, the base settled into the watchful quiet of night operations, a fortress holding back the darkness through discipline and determination. Inside, a young woman who had been cast out for being different closed her eyes and dreamed of becoming exactly what the world needed her to be. Not in spite of her differences, because of them. Dawn came to the Northern Command like a drill sergeant, harsh and unforgiving, dragging Sarah from dreams of running through forests that existed only in genetic memory. The wake-up call was not a gentle alarm, but the sharp crack of boots on concrete outside her window, accompanied by the rhythmic chanting of soldiers conducting their morning run. She had been asleep for perhaps 4 hours, her body still aching from 3 days of wilderness survival, but the military operated on schedules that cared nothing for individual exhaustion. She dressed in the uniform Magistrate Frost had provided, the fabric stiff and new against her skin. The combat fatigues were practical, designed for movement and durability rather than appearance, with reinforced knees and elbows and pockets positioned for quick access to essential gear. The boots were military standard, heavy and solid, made for marching distances that would destroy civilian footwear. Everything smelled of industrial detergent and mothballs, the scent of supply warehouses and logistics chains that kept armies functioning. Her reflection in the small mirror above the sink showed a stranger. The girl who had stood before the Grey March Tribunal 3 days ago had been thin and frightened, her posture defensive, her eyes holding the dull acceptance of someone who had learned not to hope for better. The woman who stared back now wore lieutenant's bars on her collar and something new in her expression. Not confidence exactly, not yet, but perhaps the possibility of confidence, the foundation upon which it could be built. The mess hall was already crowded when she arrived, soldiers at various stages of their morning routines. Some ate quickly, shoveling food with the efficiency of people who had learned that meals were fuel rather than pleasure. Others lingered over coffee, using the brief respite before duty called to connect with comrades or simply exist in relative peace. The noise was overwhelming after days of wilderness silence, hundreds of voices creating a wall of sound that made Sarah's inadequate wolf senses ring with overstimulation. She filled a tray with scrambled eggs, toast, and coffee that looked thick enough to stand a spoon in, then searched for an empty table. Before she could find one, a voice called her name. "Lieutenant Seraphina, over here." Colonel Cade Ironwood sat at a table near the windows, her own breakfast barely touched. The tactical officer gestured to the empty seat across from her with the casual authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Sarah navigated through the crowded hall, acutely aware of the eyes that followed her progress. New officers always drew attention, but she suspected her presence carried additional weight. Thorne's special project. The Omega who somehow raided a commission without going through basic training. "Sleep well?" Cade asked as Sarah sat, the question perfunctory rather than genuinely curious. "Well enough, ma'am," Sarah replied, which was close enough to truth for military purposes. Cade's scarred eyebrow rose fractionally. "Drop the ma'am when we are not in formal setting. Makes me feel older than I already am. In the field, stick to rank and protocol. In the mess hall, we are just soldiers trying to survive until retirement." She sipped her coffee, grimacing at the taste. Assuming any of us live that long. Sarah ate her eggs, discovering she was hungrier than she had realized. The food was institutional quality, prepared in quantities that prioritized volume over flavor, but after 3 days of field rations, it tasted like luxury. "How long have you been with the Northern Command?" she asked between bites. 12 years, Cade replied. "Came up through the ranks the traditional way. Started as a private, made corporal within 2 years, sergeant 3 years after that. Commissioned as lieutenant at 24 when my previous CO got himself killed doing something heroic and stupid." She smiled without humor. "Turned out I had a talent for not dying and an even better talent for keeping other people alive. The general promoted me to colonel 6 years ago when he needed someone who understood that warfare is mathematics wrapped in violence." Sarah processed this information, reading between the lines. Cade was career military, a soldier who had earned every rank through demonstrated competence rather than political connections or family legacy. She would have opinions about officers who received commissions without going through proper channels. Opinions she was probably too professional to voice directly, but that would color every interaction. "You think I do not deserve the rank?" Sarah said quietly, deciding direct confrontation was better than letting resentment fester. Cade set down her coffee and met Sarah's gaze with eyes that had seen too many battles to waste time on polite lies. "I think the general does not make decisions lightly. If he commissioned you, he has reasons that make sense in whatever long game he is playing. Whether you deserve it?" She shrugged. "That will be determined by how you perform when the shooting starts. Rank means nothing if you cannot back it up with competence." "Fair enough," Sarah acknowledged, respecting the honesty even as it stung. "Your training starts in 1 hour," Cade continued, shifting into professional mode. "Physical conditioning with Master Sergeant Chen, hand-to-hand combat with Captain Wolf, tactical analysis with me, and medical protocols with Dr. Marsh. The General wants you evaluated across all essential skill sets before we begin the specialized training." She paused, something almost like sympathy crossing her features. "It is going to be brutal. Chen does not believe in gentle introductions, and the others take their cues from him. If you cannot keep up, they will recommend you for discharge." "Understood," Sarah said, squaring her shoulders against the anxiety that tried to surface. "I did not come here expecting easy." "Good," Cade replied. "Because Easy left this compound about 15 years ago and has not been seen since." Master Sergeant Chen turned out to be a compact man in his late 40s, built like a concrete block and about as sympathetic. He stood on the edge of the training field with arms crossed over his chest, watching as Sarah approached with an expression that suggested he had already written her off as hopeless. The field itself was obstacle course and boot camp combined, a carefully designed torture device disguised as training equipment. "Lieutenant Seraphina," Chen said, his voice carrying the flat accent of someone who had spent more time in military bases than civilian territories. "I understand you have no formal combat training and cannot shift properly. Is this accurate?" "Yes, Sergeant," Sarah confirmed, refusing to let embarrassment color her voice. Chen nodded as if this confirmed his worst expectations. "Then we start at the beginning, running, climbing, carrying, lifting. Basic physical conditioning that every soldier must master before we add complexity." He gestured toward the track that circled the training field. 5 kilometers to start. You set your own pace, but if you walk, we start over from 0. Begin." Sarah ran. Her body protested immediately, muscles that had been pushed to their limits during 3 days of survival, screaming that they needed rest, not additional abuse. Her lungs burned as she forced air through passages that felt too narrow, her heart hammering against ribs that seemed too tight. The track stretched before her like mockery, each curve revealing yet another straightaway, each kilometer marker a reminder of how far remained. But she did not walk. Around her, other soldiers conducted their own training, some running with weighted packs, others practicing combat drills, all of them moving with the easy competence of people who had done this so many times it had become muscle memory. Sarah was slow compared to them, pathetically so, but she maintained her pace with stubborn determination. Grandmother had taught her that endurance was often more valuable than speed, that the ability to keep moving when others gave up was what separated survivors from casualties. By the 3rd kilometer, her vision had narrowed to a tunnel, the world reduced to the next step and the one after that. By the 4th, she was no longer thinking in words, her consciousness retreating to something more primal that knew only motion and the refusal to stop. When she finally crossed the 5-kilometer mark, her legs nearly buckled, but Chen was there with a canteen and an expression that might have been fractional approval. "Acceptable," he said, which from a drill sergeant probably translated to barely adequate. "Rest for 10 minutes, then we do strength training." The next 2 hours were systematic destruction disguised as exercise. Chen put her through circuits designed to identify weaknesses and exploit them mercilessly. Push-ups until her arms shook too badly to continue. Pull-ups that she could barely complete 3 of before her grip failed. Rope climbing that left her hands raw and bleeding despite the gloves Chen provided. Every exercise revealed how far she had to go, how much she lacked compared to soldiers who had been training since adolescence. But she did not quit. When the session finally ended, Sarah could barely stand, her body a single massive ache that extended from scalp to soles. Chen approached with a towel and a protein shake that tasted like chalk mixed with artificial vanilla. "You are weak," he said bluntly. "Years of inadequate nutrition and no proper training protocol. But you have work ethic, and that matters more than natural talent." He handed her a schedule. "These are your conditioning sessions for the next 6 weeks. 500 hours every morning, no exceptions. Miss 1 session and we start your evaluation over from day 1. Understood?" "Understood, Sergeant," Sarah managed, accepting the schedule with hands that trembled from exhaustion. "Good. Now you have 30 minutes to shower and change before your next session. Move." Captain Renwolf taught hand-to-hand combat in a training hall that smelled of sweat and liniment, the floor matted with material designed to soften falls that would still hurt like hell. Wolf himself was perhaps 40, lean and hard, with the kind of compact musculature that came from functional strength rather than aesthetic goals. His eyes held the flat assessment of someone who had killed people with his bare hands and lost no sleep over it. "Combat is not about winning," he began without preamble, addressing Sarah and 3 other junior officers who had been assigned to the session. "Combat is about surviving long enough to accomplish your mission. Style, technique, honor, all secondary to the fundamental goal of making sure you go home and the enemy does not." He demonstrated basic defensive positions, showing how to protect vital organs, how to use leverage against larger opponents, how to turn an attacker's momentum into their disadvantage. Then he pointed at Sarah. "You attack me." Sarah hesitated, recognizing the trap but seeing no way around it. She moved forward awkwardly, attempting something between a punch and a grab that Wolf deflected casually before sweeping her legs and putting her on the mat hard enough to knock the wind from her lungs. "Pathetic," he said flatly, offering a hand to pull her up. "But expected. You have no training and no instinct for violence." He addressed the others. "Watch her carefully. This is what happens when soldiers do not maintain their skills. They become liabilities who get their squad mates killed." The session continued in this vein for 2 brutal hours, Wolf using Sarah as his primary demonstration dummy for every technique he wanted to illustrate. By the end, she had been thrown, pinned, joint-locked, and choked out more times than she could count. Her body added new layers of pain to the foundation Chen had established, bruises forming on top of exhausted muscles. But between the demonstrations, Wolf actually taught. He showed her how to fall without injuring herself, how to protect her head and neck during throws, how to tap out before joints were damaged beyond repair. The lessons were harsh but not cruel, the teaching of someone who genuinely wanted his students to survive, but understood that comfort was the enemy of competence. "You will probably die if you see real combat in the next month," Wolf said as the session ended, his brutal honesty somehow reassuring in its directness. "But if you practice what I taught you and get lucky, you might survive long enough to get actually competent. Report back tomorrow at 1400 hours. Dismissed." Sarah limped to the showers, her body screaming protest at every movement. Under the hot water, she catalogued her injuries with clinical detachment, the skill her grandmother had drilled into her. Nothing broken, nothing that required more than ice and rest. Just the standard damage that came from pushing untrained bodies past their limits. It would heal. The question was whether she could endure 6 weeks of this systematic destruction and come out the other side as something stronger. She thought of Thorne's words from the night before. Your inability to shift may actually be an advantage. At the moment, that seemed like polite fiction designed to make her feel better about fundamental inadequacy. But her grandmother had not been a liar, and neither, she sensed, was the general. If they believed she had value, she would find a way to prove them right, even if it killed her. The afternoon brought Colonel Cade and tactical analysis, which turned out to be less physically brutal, but more intellectually demanding. Cade's office was a command center in miniature, walls covered with maps marked with colored pins representing unit positions, supply routes, and enemy movements. A conference table dominated the center of the room, its surface buried under reports and intelligence summaries that painted a picture of a war that was slowly grinding both sides into dust. Warfare is pattern recognition, Cade began, gesturing Sarah to a seat. Everything else, firepower, maneuver, morale, supports the fundamental task of recognizing enemy patterns before they recognize yours. She spread out a map showing the southern territories. Tell me what you see. Sarah studied the map, trying to apply lessons her grandmother had taught about reading terrain and understanding logistics. The enemy positions are clustered around water sources, she said slowly, and their supply lines all funnel through 3 main routes. Correct, Cade confirmed. Now tell me what that means strategically. It means they are vulnerable to interdiction, Sarah replied, her confidence growing as the pattern became clear. Cut any one of those supply routes, and you create cascading shortages across multiple units. They would have to either redistribute resources, which takes time and creates other vulnerabilities, or commit forces to protecting the routes, which thins their frontline strength. Cade's scarred eyebrow rose again, the gesture becoming familiar. The general said you had tactical instinct. I see he was not exaggerating. She pulled out another map, this one showing Northern Command territories. Now apply the same analysis to our own positions. Where are we vulnerable? The session continued for 3 hours, Cade walking Sarah through increasingly complex scenarios that required balancing multiple variables simultaneously. Resources, morale, weather, intelligence reliability, political considerations, all feeding into decisions that could mean the difference between victory and catastrophic defeat. It was exhausting in a completely different way than physical training, requiring sustained mental focus that left Sarah's head aching. But unlike the physical sessions, this training felt natural. Her mind organized information intuitively, seeing connections and patterns that became obvious once she learned to look for them. Cade noticed, her assessment shifting from skeptical to cautiously approving as the afternoon progressed. You have a gift for this, the colonel said finally, gathering up the maps and reports. Raw and untrained, but the foundation is solid. With proper education, you could become a competent tactical officer. She paused, then added with uncharacteristic warmth, Your grandmother would be proud. The words hit harder than any of the physical blows she had taken that morning. Sarah blinked rapidly, refusing to let tears form. Thank you, Colonel. That means more than you know. Cade nodded briskly, uncomfortable with sentiment. Dismissed, Lieutenant. Dr. Marsh will be expecting you at the field hospital. Do not be late. Dr. Helena Marsh was everything Sarah had hoped for in a medical supervisor. She was perhaps 50, with gray-streaked brown hair and hands that moved with the practiced economy of someone who had performed triage under fire more times than she could count. The field hospital was organized chaos, medics moving between beds where soldiers recovered from training injuries or the occasional skirmish wound that made it back to command. Marsh took one look at Sarah's limping gait and pointed to an examination table. Sit. Let me see what Chen and Wolf did to you. The examination was thorough and professional, Marsh's fingers probing bruised muscles and strained joints with the confidence of expertise. Nothing serious, the doctor pronounced. Standard damage from pushing untrained bodies too hard, too fast. Ice for 20 minutes on the worst areas, ibuprofen for pain management, and try not to let the testosterone-poisoned idiots kill you before you finish training. Yes, ma'am, Sarah replied, surprised into a laugh. Marsh handed her an ice pack and a bottle of pills. I knew your grandmother. We served together during the Iron Pass siege. She was the finest combat medic I ever worked with, and she taught me half of what I know about battlefield medicine. Her death was a loss that this war can ill afford. She taught me what she could, Sarah said quietly, but I am not her equal. Not yet, Marsh agreed, but you have time to get there, assuming you survive the next 6 weeks. She gestured around the hospital. This is where you will spend your afternoons after you finish getting beaten by Wolf. I need an assistant who understands both the medicine and the reality of treating trauma under combat conditions. Your grandmother trained you in field protocols? Everything she knew, Sarah confirmed. Then you know more than most of my current staff, who learned medicine from textbooks rather than necessity. Marsh pulled out a schedule similar to the ones Chen and Wolf had provided. Medical training follows a different rhythm than combat instruction. Less about breaking you down and more about building competence through repetition. We start with basic triage, move through trauma management, and eventually, I will teach you field surgery if you demonstrate sufficient aptitude. The next 2 hours were a crash course in military medicine, Marsh walking Sarah through the specific protocols that differed from civilian practice. Speed over perfection, because perfect treatment for one patient meant 3 others died while waiting. Brutal prioritization, sorting casualties into categories that determined who got treatment first and who got morphine and comfort as they died. Resource management when supplies were limited and resupply was uncertain. It was grim education, the teaching of someone who had learned these lessons through watching people die despite her best efforts. But it was also vital knowledge, the difference between effective care and noble futility. Sarah absorbed it all, taking notes in a small notebook Marsh provided, asking questions that demonstrated she understood not just the procedures but the philosophy behind them. You will do well here, Marsh said as the session ended. Medical personnel operate on different principles than combat soldiers. We fight death rather than enemy forces, and sometimes our victories look like keeping someone alive long enough to say goodbye. She met Sarah's eyes steadily. Your grandmother understood that. I think you do too. The days blurred together into a rhythm of systematic destruction and incremental progress. Every morning began with Chen pushing her physical limits. Every noon found her being thrown repeatedly by Wolf. Every afternoon split between Cade's intellectual challenges and Marsh's medical instruction. The routine was brutal but consistent, providing structure that Sarah found herself craving after years of being adrift in a pack that had no use for her. She learned that pain was information rather than limitation, that the body could be pushed far beyond what the mind initially considered possible. She learned that tactical analysis was pattern recognition, applied with rigorous logic, that maps were stories told in topography and movement. She learned that triage decisions that seemed monstrous in theory became necessary in practice, that saving 10 people sometimes required letting one die. But most importantly, she learned that competence was cumulative. Each day's training built on the previous, creating a foundation of skills that began to feel like second nature. The run that had nearly killed her in week 1 became merely difficult by week 3. The defensive techniques that had seemed impossible to execute began flowing naturally after Wolf corrected her positioning for the 100th time. The medical procedures that had required constant reference to notes became reflexive after performing them on enough training dummies. General Thorne observed her training at irregular intervals, appearing without warning to watch her run or analyze tactical scenarios with Cade. He never offered encouragement or criticism, simply observed with those ice-blue eyes that seemed to catalog every strength and weakness for future reference. His presence was both motivating and intimidating, a constant reminder that someone expected significant return on this investment of time and resources. The other soldiers gradually stopped treating her as oddity and began accepting her as simply another trainee suffering through the same systematic abuse they had all endured. Corporal Mira Stone offered tips on managing muscle soreness. Private Lena Cross shared her extra protein bars when she noticed Sarah struggling to maintain weight despite increased food intake. Even Chen, who remained ruthlessly demanding, began acknowledging her progress with fractional nods that felt like standing ovations. 3 weeks into training, everything changed. Sarah was in Cade's office analyzing supply manifests when alarms blared throughout the compound, the specific pattern that indicated not drill but genuine emergency. Cade was moving before the alarms finished, grabbing her tactical vest from the back of her chair and heading for the door at a run. Sarah followed instinctively, her medical training overriding questions about protocol. The command center was controlled chaos when they arrived, officers and analysts coordinating responses to multiple simultaneous reports. Thorne stood at the center of the activity, his presence commanding attention despite speaking in a voice barely above conversational volume. The situation board showed what had triggered the alarms. Enemy forces had crossed the southern border in significant numbers, pushing north with aggressive speed. "Report," Thorne ordered, his eyes finding Major Wren Wolfe, who stood at the intelligence station. "Grey March remnants, sir," Wren replied, his voice tight with the tension of delivering bad news. "Reinforce battalion strength, moving north along the eastern approach route. They punch through our forward observers without engaging, which suggests their objective is not territorial seizure." "What is their objective?" Cade asked, moving to study the situation board. Wren glanced at Sarah, and something in his expression made her blood run cold. "Intelligence intercepts suggest they are searching for someone specific, a target they believe to be at this location." Sarah felt every eye in the command center turn toward her. The certainty settled over her like weight, crushing and inescapable. They had come for her. Elder Matthias or someone else in Grey March leadership had decided that letting her go was a mistake, and now they were rectifying that error regardless of the diplomatic consequences. The room remained silent for 3 heartbeats, every officer waiting for Thorne's decision. The general's face revealed nothing, but Sarah saw calculation moving behind his eyes, weighing options against each other with the speed of someone who had made life and death decisions so many times they had become instinctive. "Threat assessment," Thorne said calmly, as if discussing weather rather than invasion. "Can our defenses hold them?" "Yes, sir," Cade replied immediately, "but engagement means casualties and resource expenditure we had allocated elsewhere. It also means escalation with Grey March, potentially drawing other factions into open conflict." "Alternative options?" Thorne asked, his gaze sweeping the room. "Evacuate the target," Major Wren suggested carefully. "If they truly are searching for someone specific, removing that person eliminates their objective and potentially encourages withdrawal." Sarah found her voice, forcing words through the fear that tried to strangle them. "General, I volunteer for evacuation. This situation is my responsibility. I should not be the reason soldiers die." Thorne finally looked directly at her, and something in his expression made her previous fear seem inadequate. "No," he said flatly. "We do not negotiate with invasion forces by giving them what they want. It establishes precedent that encourages future aggression." "Sir," Cade interjected, her tactical mind already working the problem, "what if we turn their aggression into opportunity? They are moving with speed rather than caution, which means they are exposing themselves. If Lieutenant Seraphina volunteers as bait, we could create an ambush scenario that eliminates their forward elements while gathering intelligence on their true capabilities and intentions." The room went quiet again as officers processed this suggestion. It was tactically sound but ethically questionable, using a junior officer as bait in an operation that could easily turn lethal. Sarah saw several faces register disapproval, but no one spoke against it. In war, ethics often surrendered to necessity. Thorne studied Sarah with an intensity that felt like being dissected. "Lieutenant Seraphina, you are 3 weeks into a 6-week training program. You are not qualified for special operations work, and this scenario has significant risk of capture or death. I cannot order you to participate. It must be your choice." Sarah thought of the soldiers who would die defending the compound if Grey March attacked in force. She thought of her grandmother's teachings about duty and sacrifice. She thought of the past 3 weeks, of Chen and Wolfe and Cade and Marsh investing their time and expertise in transforming her from cast-off Omega into something that might be valuable. "I volunteer, sir," she said clearly. "I have debts to pay." "What debts?" Thorne asked, and genuine curiosity colored his question. "Your men saved me that night in the cave," Sarah replied. "Whether they intended to or not, they gave me shelter and the chance to prove I had value. Time to return the favor." Something shifted in Thorne's expression, respect replacing calculation. "Very well. Colonel Cade, you have operational authority. Design the ambush, brief the relevant personnel, and prepare Lieutenant Seraphina for her role. We execute at dawn." The next 18 hours were a blur of planning and preparation that made Sarah's training look leisurely by comparison. Cade assembled a team of special operations personnel, each one a veteran with more combat experience than Sarah had years of life. They reviewed terrain, planned extraction routes, established communication protocols, and ran through contingency plans for every scenario they could imagine going wrong. Sarah was fitted with covert communications equipment, a small earpiece and transmitter disguised as jewelry that would allow her to relay intelligence in real time. She received a crash course in intelligence gathering, learning what information was valuable and how to report it concisely. Wolf gave her a weapon, a compact sidearm that felt alien in her hands, and spent an hour teaching her basic marksmanship, even though everyone understood she was not being sent to fight. The evening before the operation, Thorne summoned her to his office. He looked tired in a way she had not seen before, the weight of command visible in the lines around his eyes and the tension in his shoulders. He poured 2 glasses of whiskey from a bottle he kept in his desk drawer and offered one to Sarah without asking if she drank. "To questionable decisions," he said, raising his glass. "To survival," Sarah replied, clinking her glass against his and drinking. The whiskey burned going down, harsh and smoky, nothing like the sweet wine served at Grey March ceremonies. Thorne drank and set his glass down carefully. "I want you to understand something before tomorrow. This operation is not about the Halfling protocol or fulfilling prophecies or any of the larger strategic concerns that brought you here. It is about the immediate tactical necessity of dealing with an invasion force while minimizing casualties. You will be in danger regardless of how well we plan." "I understand, sir," Sarah said, "and I am still volunteering." "I know," Thorne replied. "That is what concerns me." He moved to the window, looking out over the compound where soldiers continued their evening routines, unaware of the operation being planned. 17 years ago, your grandmother saved my life. In the years since, I have tried to honor that debt by building something worth saving. A command structure that values competence over politics, that protects those who cannot protect themselves, that fights for something beyond mere survival. He turned back to face her, and for the first time since she had met him, his cold control slipped enough to show the human underneath. "If you die tomorrow, if this operation goes wrong and I lose you the way I lost my brother, I will have failed both of them. Your grandmother trusted me to see your value. I need you to trust me to get you home." The admission of vulnerability hit harder than any of Wolf's throws. Sarah set down her glass and met his gaze steadily. "General, with all due respect, you said you needed someone who would question orders. So here is my question. Are you refusing to let me participate because it is the wrong tactical decision, or because you are afraid of failing people you care about?" Thorne stared at her for a long moment, then laughed, a sound without humor. "You sound like your grandmother. She used to call me out the same way." He returned to his desk and refilled both glasses. "The operation proceeds as planned, but I want you to know that if the situation turns bad, if capture seems imminent, Cade has orders to extract you regardless of intelligence value. Your safety is the priority." "Understood, sir," Sarah said, accepting the second drink. "And thank you." "For what?" "For caring enough to be afraid," she replied simply. "It makes this easier." They finished their drinks in companionable silence, 2 people facing an uncertain tomorrow with the fragile comfort of shared purpose. When Sarah finally left his office, she felt something had shifted between them. Not romance, not yet, perhaps not ever, but partnership. The foundation of trust that came from recognizing someone else's humanity beneath their professional role. Dawn arrived too quickly, and not fast enough, anticipation and dread making the hours both crawl and race. Sarah dressed in civilian clothes that had been selected to look like someone traveling through territories rather than military personnel. Her communications equipment was hidden beneath a scarf, the weapon Wolf had given her concealed in a holster at the small of her back. She looked like exactly what she was supposed to be, a refugee trying to survive in hostile territory. The staging area was 5 kilometers south of the compound, a location intelligence suggested Grey March forces would pass through on their approach. Cade's team positioned themselves in concealment around the area, setting up overlapping fields of fire and establishing observation posts that would allow them to monitor the situation without being detected. Sarah was placed in an abandoned farmhouse, visible enough to be found, but defensible enough to provide brief cover if things went wrong. The waiting was worse than any training session. Sarah sat in the empty farmhouse and listened to her own heartbeat, trying to maintain the calm her grandmother had taught her. Fear is information, Alara had said. It tells you danger is present, but panic is noise that prevents you from processing that information effectively. Feel the fear, acknowledge it, then set it aside and focus on what needs to be done. The radio in her ear crackled to life. "Movement," Cade's voice reported, professionally neutral. "Multiple contacts approaching from the south. Estimate 20 minutes to your position. Stay calm and follow the plan." Sarah acknowledged with 2 clicks of her transmitter, the signal they had agreed upon for silent confirmation. She moved to the window and watched the southern approach, her inadequate senses straining to detect movement that remained invisible to civilian eyes. But she could hear them now, the distant sound of many bodies moving through underbrush, the occasional murmur of voices giving orders. Grey March Remnant was coming, and she was the bait that would draw them into Cade's trap. The question was whether she would survive long enough to see how the gambit played out. Outside, the sun climbed higher into a sky that promised the kind of clear winter day that made visibility excellent and concealment difficult. Perfect weather for an ambush, perfect weather for everything to go catastrophically wrong. Sarah touched the pendant her grandmother had given her and whispered words that were half prayer and half promise. "Trust your instincts. They are stronger than you know." She hoped Alara was right, because in the next few minutes, those instincts would mean the difference between intelligence coup and disaster. They came through the tree line like ghosts made solid, 20 wolves moving with the coordinated precision of soldiers who had fought together long enough to anticipate each other's movements. Sarah watched from her position at the farmhouse window, her heart hammering against her ribs as she catalogued details with the tactical awareness Cade had drilled into her over 3 weeks. Formation spacing suggested professional military rather than rabble. Weapons discipline indicated recent combat experience. The way they swept the terrain in overlapping arcs spoke of training that went beyond basic pack dynamics. These were not desperate refugees or poorly organized raiders. These were career soldiers conducting a search and seizure operation with professional competence. "Contact confirmed," Sarah whispered into her concealed transmitter, keeping her voice barely audible. 20 personnel, military formation, approaching from grid reference 73 Delta. They know what they are doing. "Copy that," Cade's voice replied in her earpiece, calm as if discussing weather. "Remember the plan. Let them find you, maintain position until they reveal their objective, then signal for extraction. We have you covered." Easy for Cade to say from concealment with a rifle and backup. Sarah was alone in an empty farmhouse with a weapon she barely knew how to use and instructions to let enemy soldiers capture her. The logic made sense when reviewed on tactical maps in the safety of command headquarters. In the moment, with armed wolves closing on her position, it felt like volunteering for execution. The lead wolf shifted to human form as he reached the farmhouse perimeter, a smooth transformation that took perhaps 3 seconds and left him standing fully clothed in combat fatigues that had been secured to his body during the shift. The efficiency of it made Sarah's inadequate partial transformation seem even more pathetic by comparison. This was what proper wolves could do, the seamless integration of human and animal that her genetics had denied her. But she was not here to shift. She was here to gather intelligence and trust that Cade's team would keep her alive long enough to report it. The man who had shifted was younger than she expected, perhaps 25, with the kind of lean musculature that came from campaign living, and the watchful eyes of someone who had learned paranoia was survival trait rather than character flaw. He signaled to his team with hand gestures that Sarah recognized from her tactical training. Standard search pattern, weapons ready, assume hostile until proven otherwise. 2 soldiers broke off to circle the farmhouse, while the rest maintained covering positions. Professional work, minimizing exposure while maximizing tactical advantage. Whoever commanded this unit understood small unit tactics at a level that suggested formal military education rather than learning through trial and error. The young soldier approached the farmhouse door, his sidearm held in a ready position that was neither threatening nor casual. He knocked once, the sound sharp in the winter quiet. "Northern Command Forces," he called out, his voice carrying the accent of Southern territories. "We are conducting a search operation authorized under emergency protocols. If there are civilians inside, identify yourself and exit the building with hands visible." The lie was elegant. Claiming to be Northern Command personnel gave them authority while suggesting Sarah was safe to reveal herself. If she had been an actual civilian, the deception would have been perfect. As it was, she recognized the tactic for what it was: misdirection designed to create false sense of security. Sarah made her decision. She moved away from the window, positioning herself in the center of the farmhouse's main room, where she would be visible immediately, but not close enough to be grabbed without warning. Then she spoke loud enough to be heard through the walls. "I am here, civilian. I am coming out." She opened the door slowly, keeping her hands in clear view, doing exactly what a frightened refugee would do when confronted by armed soldiers. The young soldier's eyes widened fractionally when he saw her, recognition and surprise mixing in his expression before professional control reasserted itself. "Seraphina," he said, and it was not a question. "Stand down," he called to his team. "Target confirmed. Site secure." The other soldiers materialized from concealment, forming a loose perimeter around the farmhouse with practiced efficiency. Most remained in wolf form, their animal senses more useful for detecting threats than human eyes. But 3 more shifted to human configuration, including an older soldier whose weathered face and gray-streaked hair marked him as veteran of campaigns that predated the current conflict. Elder Matthias Ashford stepped forward, and Sarah's world tilted on its axis. She had expected Grey March leadership to send soldiers. She had not expected Elder Matthias himself to lead the operation, to risk his own life crossing hostile territory to reach her. The man who had exiled her now stood 10 feet away with an expression that mixed relief and anguish in equal measure, his eyes tracking over her as if confirming she was real and undamaged. "Seraphina," he said, and his voice cracked on her name. "Thank the ancestors. We feared we were too late." "Too late for what?" Sarah demanded, anger cutting through her fear. "You cast me out, Elder. You declared me defective and sent me away to die. Why would you possibly care if I survived?" Matthias's expression twisted with something that looked like pain. "Because I am your father," he said quietly, the words dropping into the winter morning like stones into still water. "And exiling you was the only way I could save your life." The world stopped. Sarah heard the words, understood them linguistically, but could not process their meaning. Matthias was her father, the man who had stood in the tribunal chamber and declared her worthless, who had given her 72 hours to leave the only home she had ever known, who had watched her walk away without expressing a single word of regret or affection. That man was claiming to be her father. "Liar," she whispered, the word barely audible. "I wish I was," Matthias replied, his weathered face showing every one of his 65 years. "Your mother and I, it was brief and foolish and completely against protocol. She was Omega caste. I was already married, already alpha of the pack. When she told me she was pregnant, we both knew the child could never be publicly acknowledged." His hands clenched at his sides. "Alara agreed to raise you as her granddaughter. It was the only way to protect you from pack politics that would have destroyed you before you drew first breath." Sarah's mind raced, reviewing her entire childhood through this new and terrible lens. Grandmother Alara had never spoken of Sarah's parents except to say they had died. The pendant she wore, supposedly a family heirloom, took on new significance. The way Matthias had always watched her with distant sorrow rather than contempt. The fact that he had provided 72 hours warning and supplied her with quality survival gear when others would have simply driven her into the wilderness unprepared. "Why tell me this now?" she asked, her voice steady despite the chaos in her thoughts. "Why come after me at all?" "Because Grey March leadership discovered the truth," Matthias said grimly. "They learned about the Halfling protocol from intelligence intercepts, learned that Thorne Blackridge was searching for someone matching your genetic markers, learned that I had hidden and protected you for 22 years. His eyes hardened. They wanted to conscript you, force you into military service for Grey March interests. When I refused, they threatened to expose everything and destroy what remains of my authority. So you exiled me to prevent forced conscription," Sarah said slowly, pieces falling into horrible alignment. "You gave me chance to escape before they could take me." "I gave you 3 days head start and prayed you would run far enough that no one would find you," Matthias confirmed. "I did not know about Thorne's search operations. I did not know he would find you so quickly." His expression turned desperate. "When I learned you were at Northern Command, I realized my mistake. I sent you away to protect you from being weaponized, but I sent you directly to the one person who would recognize your value and use it strategically." Sarah processed this cascade of revelations, her tactical training kicking in despite emotional turmoil. Elder Matthias believed he was rescuing her from Thorne. He saw the general as threat rather than ally, someone who would exploit her abilities without regard for her well-being. It was the perspective of someone who had lived through the original Halfling protocol and watched it destroy the lives of people forced into service against their will. But Matthias had not been there for 3 weeks of training. He had not seen Thorne agonize over sending her into danger. He had not heard the general admit his fear of failing another person he cared about. He was operating on assumptions that might have been true once, but no longer reflected reality. "Did you kill my mother?" Sarah asked, the question escaping before she could consider whether she wanted the answer. "No," Matthias said immediately. "She died in a border skirmish 7 years after you were born, caught between opposing forces during a territorial dispute that should never have escalated to violence." He closed his eyes briefly. "I could not acknowledge her publicly, could not mourn her openly, could not even attend her funeral without raising questions. That guilt has lived with me every day since." The radio in Sarah's ear crackled with Cade's voice, quiet but urgent. "Lieutenant, you need to signal extraction or provide intelligence. What is their objective?" Sarah clicked her transmitter once, the signal for wait, maintain position. She met Matthias's gaze steadily, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time. Not the harsh elder who had exiled her, but a man who had made impossible choices trying to protect a daughter he could never acknowledge. Not a villain, but a tragic figure caught between duty and love, with no good options available. "What happens now, Elder?" she asked. "You found me. What was your plan?" "We take you home," Matthias said. "Back to Grey March territories, away from military conscription, away from wars that will consume you if you stay." His voice took on urgency. "I know you have no reason to trust me. I know my actions have earned nothing but your hatred. But I am asking you, as your father, to let me correct my mistake. Let me get you somewhere safe." "And if I refuse?" Sarah asked quietly. "If I tell you I am staying at Northern Command by choice?" Matthias's expression hardened into something more familiar. The Alpha who had commanded Grey March Remnant through 20 years of grinding warfare. "Then I take you by force, because allowing you to be weaponized by any military organization is a fate I cannot permit. You may hate me for it. You may never forgive me, but I will not lose you again to war machines that consume young lives without remorse." The soldiers around them tensed, reading their commander's shift in tone. Hands moved toward weapons with professional readiness. The situation balanced on knife edge. One word away from violence that would shatter Cade's carefully planned ambush and potentially end with Sarah dead in the crossfire. "General Thorne did not conscript me," Sarah said clearly, projecting her voice so all the soldiers could hear. "He offered me training and commission as officer, and I accepted voluntarily. He has invested 3 weeks teaching me skills I never would have learned in Grey March. He has treated me with more respect than I ever received from the pack that supposedly valued me." "You cannot know that you chose freely," Matthias argued. "You were desperate, alone, facing death from exposure. When someone offers salvation in those circumstances, it is not truly choice, but survival instinct masquerading as decision." "Then let me demonstrate that I understand exactly what I am choosing," Sarah replied. She reached behind her back with deliberate slowness and withdrew the sidearm Wolf had given her, keeping it pointed at the ground but making its presence known. "I am not a helpless Omega anymore, Elder. I am a lieutenant in the Northern Command, and I have duties that supersede family politics." "Seraphina," Matthias said, his voice dropping to something almost pleading, "do not make me take you by force, please." In her ear, Cade's voice cut through the tension. "Lieutenant, situation assessment. Do you require extraction?" Sarah clicked her transmitter twice. "Negative. Maintain position." To Matthias she said, "You taught me to honor duty above personal desire. You taught the entire pack that hard choices define character more than comfortable ones. I am making a hard choice now. I am choosing to stay with the Northern Command because they value what I can become rather than mourning what I cannot be." Matthias stared at her for long seconds, emotions warring across his weathered face. Then his expression closed down into cold professional assessment. "Team," he ordered. "Prepare for tactical extraction of primary target. Non-lethal force authorized but not required if target resists." The world exploded into motion. Sarah raised her weapon in the smooth motion Wolf had drilled into her, but she was hopelessly outmatched, and everyone present knew it. The young soldier who had first approached moved with enhanced speed, closing the distance before she could properly aim. His hand locked around her wrist with crushing force, the weapon spinning away into snow as her inadequate strength failed against his augmented grip. "Execute extraction," Cade's voice commanded in her ear, all professional calm vanishing into urgent action. The tree line erupted with gunfire. Cade's team had been positioned in overlapping fields of fire that turned the farmhouse clearing into a kill zone with no safe retreat. Northern Command soldiers appeared from concealment that had been invisible seconds before, their weapons trained on Grey March personnel with professional precision. The ambush was textbook perfect, catching the Grey March force with their attention focused on Sarah and their weapons pointed wrong directions. "Stand down," Cade's voice amplified through portable speakers. "You are surrounded by superior force. Surrender, and you will be treated according to Geneva Convention protocols for prisoners of war. Resist, and you will be eliminated." Matthias's face registered shock and fury in equal measure as he realized the trap. He had been so focused on rescuing Sarah that he had walked his entire team into tactical nightmare. His soldiers looked to him for orders, their weapons drawn, but facing too many directions to engage effectively. For 3 heartbeats, the situation balanced between surrender and slaughter. Then Matthias made his decision. He shifted in the explosive transformation that marked desperation, his human form dissolving into something massive and gray with amber eyes that burned with paternal rage. Other soldiers followed his lead, the Grey March force choosing death in battle over capture and humiliation. The clearing became chaos. Cade's team engaged with disciplined fire, aiming for limbs and non-lethal targets where possible. But some of the Grey March wolves were moving too fast for precision shooting. Bodies hit the ground, some shifting back to human form in death, others staying wolf. The snow turned red with blood that steamed in the winter cold. Sarah found herself knocked to the ground by the young soldier who still gripped her wrist, his body shielding hers from the gunfire, an instinctive gesture that suggested his orders to protect her superseded everything else, including self-preservation. She struggled against his hold, her training with Wolf providing techniques to break grips, but the soldier was stronger and faster despite her best efforts. Then a gray wolf launched itself at the soldier with killing intent, and Sarah recognized Matthias in the fury of its attack. Her father, the man who had exiled her to protect her, now fighting to the death to take her home. The soldier released her to defend himself, shifting mid-motion to meet the attack in wolf form. The 2 bodies collided with impact that shook the ground, fangs and claws seeking vital targets with lethal precision. "Stop!" Sarah screamed, but her voice disappeared into the cacophony of gunfire and snarling wolves. "This is not what I wanted." Another wolf appeared beside her, this one wearing the distinctive markings of Northern Command. Not attacking, but defensive, positioning itself between Sarah and the worst of the fighting. Through the chaos, she heard Cade's voice, closer now, cutting through the violence with command authority that demanded obedience. "Ceasefire! All units ceasefire immediately!" The shooting stopped with shocking abruptness, discipline overriding adrenaline as Northern Command soldiers obeyed their officer. The silence that followed was broken only by the sounds of wounded wolves and the harsh breathing of those still standing. Sarah counted quickly. 8 Grey March soldiers down, mixture of dead and wounded. 12 still standing, but surrounded with no avenue of escape. Matthias remained in wolf form, standing over the young soldier who had tried to protect Sarah, his jaws inches from the vulnerable throat. "Alpha!" "Matthias!" Cade called, her voice carrying across the clearing. "The operation is over. Your force is defeated and surrounded. Order your wolves to stand down before more die unnecessarily." Matthias turned his massive head toward Sarah, and something in those amber eyes broke her heart. Grief and failure and desperate love mixed into expression that transcended species barrier. He had risked everything to save her, and instead he had doomed his soldiers to capture or death while achieving nothing. "Please," Sarah said quietly, moving toward him slowly with hands raised in non-threatening gesture. "Please shift back. Talk to me as father to daughter, not as alpha to exile." The great wolf held her gaze for eternal seconds. Then he shifted, returning to human form with shoulders bowed under weight of defeat. Around him, the surviving Grey March soldiers followed suit, the fight draining from them as their commander surrendered. Matthias knelt in the bloody snow, no longer the proud elder who had commanded respect for decades, but simply an aging man who had failed at the one thing that mattered most. "I am sorry," he said, and the words encompassed more than just this moment. "I am sorry for everything, for abandoning your mother, for hiding the truth, for casting you out when I should have fought to keep you, for trying to force you to safety when you had already found your own path." Sarah knelt beside him, ignoring Cade's shouted warning about maintaining safe distance. She had spent 3 weeks learning to fight, to think tactically, to put mission before personal concerns. But in this moment, she was simply a daughter facing her father for the first time with truth between them rather than lies and politics. "You made choices you believed were right," she said quietly. "You protected me the only way you knew how. I cannot forgive everything, not yet, maybe not ever, but I understand why you did it." Matthias looked at her with eyes that held 30 years of regret. "What happens now?" Cade approached, her weapon holstered but her expression hard. "That depends on whether you cooperate, Elder. You led an invasion force into Northern Command territory. Under military law, that makes you and your soldiers prisoners of war subject to interrogation and potential trial for war crimes." "War crimes," Matthias repeated bitterly. "For trying to save my daughter from being weaponized by military interests. For crossing borders with armed force and engaging in hostile action," Cade corrected. "Motivation is irrelevant to legal classification." A new voice cut across the argument, cold and carrying absolute authority. "I believe context matters, Colonel." General Thorne emerged from the tree line, and Sarah realized he had been present for the entire engagement, observing from concealment while Cade managed tactical operations. He moved through the carnage with professional detachment, cataloging casualties and assessing the strategic situation with eyes that missed nothing. He stopped before Matthias, looking down at the kneeling elder with expression impossible to read. Alpha Matthias Ashford, formerly Major Matthias Ashford of the 3rd Infantry Division, decorated veteran of Iron Pass Siege and approximately 30 other major engagements. Your service record suggests you understand military necessity. Do you contest my assessment? Matthias met Thorne's gaze steadily. "I understand military necessity, General. I also understand what happens to special assets in wartime. They get used until they break, then discarded when no longer functional. I watched it happen during the original Halfling protocol. I will not watch it happen to my daughter." Thorne nodded slowly, as if this was reasonable concern rather than accusation. "You believe I conscripted Lieutenant Seraphina against her will and would exploit her abilities without regard for her well-being or long-term survival. This is accurate assessment of your position?" "Yes," Matthias confirmed. "Then allow me to correct your misapprehension," Thorne said. He gestured to Sarah. "Lieutenant, report. Have you been coerced or forced to participate in any activities against your will during your time at Northern Command?" "No, sir," Sarah replied formally, recognizing he was creating record for witnesses present. "All training and operational assignments have been voluntary. I was offered the option to decline without negative consequences. Have you been adequately supplied with food, quarters, medical care, and other necessities appropriate to your rank and station?" "Yes, sir. Superior to anything I received at Grey March Remnant." "And when you volunteered to serve as bait in this operation, did I attempt to dissuade you or express concern for your safety?" "You did, sir. You stated you could not order me to participate and that it must be my choice. You also expressed personal concern about failing my grandmother's trust if I was killed." Thorne turned back to Matthias. "Does this sound like an officer exploiting a desperate recruit, or does it perhaps suggest more nuanced situation than your assumptions allowed for?" Matthias stared between Thorne and Sarah, processing this information with visible difficulty. "You volunteered?" he asked her directly. "For an operation that could have killed you?" "I volunteered," Sarah confirmed, "because soldiers under my theoretical command were at risk, because I have debts to repay and duties to honor, because General Thorne invested 3 weeks training me when he could have simply used me for intelligence value and discarded me after." She met her father's eyes steadily. "Everything you think you know about the Halfling protocol is colored by how it operated 30 years ago under different command structure with different ethical standards. This is not that program." Matthias struggled with this, decades of assumptions warring against evidence before his eyes. What is it then? It is a training program for soldiers who happen to have unusual genetic markers, Thorne said flatly. Nothing more, nothing less. Lieutenant Seraphina receives the same basic instruction as any junior officer, plus specialized development appropriate to her capabilities. When her training is complete, she will be assigned duties that utilize her skills while minimizing unnecessary risk. If she chooses to leave the Northern Command at any point, she will receive honorable discharge and resettlement assistance. He moved closer to Matthias, his voice dropping to something almost conversational. I am not a monster, Major. I am a general trying to win an unwinnable war with insufficient resources and outdated tactics. Your daughter represents potential tactical advantage, yes, but she also represents something more important. Proof that our prejudices about proper wolves and defective omegas are obsolete thinking that costs us valuable personnel. Matthias looked at Sarah with expression she had never seen on his face before. Pride, mixed with grief that he had not been the one to teach her these truths. You truly want to stay, he said, making it half question and half statement. I truly want to stay, Sarah confirmed, not because I was coerced or tricked, but because for the first time in my life, people value what I can do, rather than mourning what I cannot. Because Colonel Cade teaches me tactics, and Captain Wolfe teaches me to fight, and Dr. Marsh teaches me medicine, and none of them care that I cannot shift properly. She felt tears threatening but refused to let them fall. You cast me out believing it was mercy. It turned out to be the greatest gift you could have given me, freedom to find my own worth. The clearing remained silent as everyone processed this exchange. Finally, Matthias rose slowly, moving like man who had aged years in minutes. General Thorne, he said formally, I request permission to surrender my force and accept responsibility for this incursion. My soldiers were following orders they believed to be legitimate. They should not be punished for my mistakes. Request noted, Thorne replied. However, I am more interested in preventing future incidents than punishing past ones. He gestured to the casualties. 8 of your soldiers are dead or critically wounded because of tactical miscalculation based on faulty intelligence. How many more Grey March personnel will die if you return and report that Northern Command held you captive or treated you dishonorably? Matthias's eyes narrowed. What are you proposing, General? An exchange of information, Thorne said. You tell me what intelligence led you to believe Lieutenant Seraphina needed rescuing. I show you the reality of her situation here, including full access to training records, quarters, and the freedom to interview her privately without Northern Command personnel present. Then you make an informed decision about whether to request her release or acknowledge that she is exactly where she chooses to be. And if I request her release? Then we negotiate terms like professionals, Thorne said. But I suspect that after seeing the evidence, you will reach different conclusion. He looked at Sarah. Lieutenant, do you consent to private interview with your father? Yes, sir, Sarah replied. I believe he deserves the truth. Very well, Thorne said. Colonel Cade, have medical personnel treat the wounded from both sides. Alpha Matthias and his command staff will accompany me to Northern Command headquarters as guests rather than prisoners, with the understanding that any hostile action will result in their immediate detention. All other Grey March personnel will remain here under guard until situation is resolved. He met Matthias's gaze steadily. You have my word as officer that no harm will come to your soldiers while negotiations proceed. Matthias studied Thorne for a long moment, then nodded once. Accepted. But if I discover you have harmed or coerced my daughter in any way, general rank and military necessity will not protect you from my response. Fair terms, Thorne acknowledged. Lieutenant, you will escort Alpha Matthias and demonstrate your actual situation. Show him everything. Answer his questions honestly. Help him understand what you have become. The journey back to Northern Command headquarters felt surreal, traveling alongside the man who had raised her without acknowledging their connection, while soldiers from opposing forces maintained wary truce around them. Matthias said nothing during the transport, his eyes constantly moving to catalog everything he saw. The maintained roads, the organized checkpoints, the soldiers who saluted Sarah's Lieutenant Bars with genuine respect rather than mocking contempt. When they reached the compound, Sarah took him on comprehensive tour. The officer barracks where her quarters were comparable to those of any junior officer, the training facilities where Chen and Wolfe worked with multiple trainees, not just her, the field hospital where Dr. Marsh supervised staff treating wounded from both sides without discrimination, The mess hall, where soldiers of various ranks shared meals and conversation with ease, that spoke to genuine unit cohesion rather than forced compliance. Matthias observed everything with professional eye, asking occasional questions that revealed his military background. The compound was clean, organized, well supplied. The personnel were disciplined but not cowed, showing the kind of morale that came from competent leadership rather than fear-based control. Every detail contradicted the image of brutal war machine conscripting desperate refugees. Finally, Sarah led him to Cade's office, where the tactical officer had spread out Sarah's training records and evaluation reports. Matthias read through them with growing surprise, seeing documented progression from barely functional to competent in multiple essential skills. "Her performance has been exceptional given her starting point," Cade said neutrally. "She has aptitude for tactical analysis that would be valuable in any intelligence or planning role. Her medical skills are already superior to many of our field medics, and her work ethic has earned respect from personnel who were initially skeptical about commissioning someone without formal basic training." "You truly chose this," Matthias said to Sarah, the statement almost a plea. "I truly chose this," she confirmed. "I know you spent 22 years trying to protect me from being weaponized, but the weapon was never my abilities, Father. It was the belief that I was worthless because I was different. General Thorne gave me the chance to prove that belief wrong. Everything else followed from that." Matthias was quiet for a long time, processing decades of assumptions against 3 hours of contrary evidence. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "I owe you an apology, multiple apologies, for more failures than I can properly enumerate. But most importantly for assuming I knew what was best for you without ever asking what you wanted." "You did what you thought was right," Sarah said. "I cannot blame you for that." "Yes, you can," Matthias replied, "and probably should." He looked at Cade. "Tell General Thorne that I acknowledge my intelligence was faulty and my actions were based on incorrect assumptions. Greymarch Remnant withdraws any claim to Lieutenant Seraphina and recognizes her commission with Northern Command as legitimate and voluntary." Cade nodded once. "I will relay your statement. The wounded from your force are receiving medical care and will be returned when stable for transport. You and your soldiers are free to leave once our medical staff clears them for travel." "Thank you, Colonel," Matthias said formally. Then to Sarah, "May I speak with you privately?" They walked to a quiet corner of the compound where the sounds of military activity faded to distant background. Matthias looked older than his 65 years, burdened with regrets that had finally caught up with him. "Your grandmother would be proud," he said quietly. "Alara always believed you had value that the pack was too blind to see. She spent her life protecting you so that someday you could find place that recognized your worth." He managed a sad smile. "I think she would approve of General Thorne. She always said the best commanders were the ones who cared enough to be afraid of failing their people." Sarah touched the pendant around her neck. "She never told me you were my father." "She promised not to, unless circumstances made it necessary," Matthias said. "We agreed that plausible deniability protected you from pack politics. If no one knew for certain, then no one could use you as leverage against me." He sighed. "It seemed wise at the time. Now I wonder how much pain I could have prevented if I had simply acknowledged you and dealt with the political consequences." "We cannot change the past," Sarah said, "only decide how we move forward from here." Matthias met her eyes, his own bright with unshed tears. "I would like to know you, Seraphina. Not as exile I cast out, not as genetic asset to be protected, but as daughter I never allowed myself to acknowledge. I understand if you refuse. I understand if the damage is too great to repair. But I am asking for the chance to try." Sarah considered this, weighing years of hurt against the man before her who had made terrible choices from place of desperate love. "I am not ready to call you father yet," she said honestly, "but I am willing to try knowing you as person. Write to me. Tell me about my mother. Help me understand the choices you made. Maybe eventually we can build something that resembles family." Matthias nodded, accepting the conditional offer with visible relief. "That is more than I deserve and more than I dared hope for. Thank you." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching soldiers go about their duties, two people finding tentative peace after years of lies and protection that had created more damage than it prevented. Eventually, Matthias had to leave, his wounded soldiers ready for transport back to Greymarch territories. But before he went, he pulled something from his pocket and offered it to Sarah. "This was your mother's," he said. The only photograph I have of her. I would like you to have it." Sarah accepted the small photograph, seeing a young woman with blonde hair and a smile that lit her entire face. Her mother, whose name she had never known, whose existence had been reduced to convenient lie about death and childbirth. Now she had face to attach to the absence that had shaped her entire life. "What was her name?" she asked. "Catherine," Matthias replied. "Catherine Whitmore. She was Omega caste, but she had more courage than most alphas I knew. You have her smile." "Thank you," Sarah said, clutching the photograph carefully, "for this and for finally telling me the truth." After Matthias left, Sarah reported to Thorne's office as instructed. The general sat behind his desk, reading through after-action reports with the focused attention he brought to everything. He looked up as she entered, his ice-blue eyes assessing her emotional state with practiced ease. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the chair. "Tell me how you are processing this development." Sarah sat, organizing her thoughts before speaking. "I learned my father is not who I thought, that my entire childhood was carefully constructed protection rather than neglect, that the exile I believed was cruelty was actually desperate attempt to save me from forced conscription." She paused. "I should feel betrayed or angry, but mostly I just feel sad for all the years we lost because he was too afraid to acknowledge the truth." "Understandable reaction," Thorne said. He set aside the reports, giving her his complete attention. "The question is whether this changes your commitment to Northern Command. You now have option to return to Greymarch with your father's blessing and protection. No one would fault you for choosing family over military service." "It does not change anything," Sarah said firmly. "My father spent 22 years trying to protect me from becoming weapon. But he was protecting me from wrong threat. The real threat was never that someone would use my abilities. It was that I would spend my entire life believing I had no abilities worth using." Thorne smiled, the expression transforming his usually stern features into something almost warm. "That is the correct answer, Lieutenant." He opened a drawer and withdrew a folder. "Your training evaluation reports are complete. Master Sergeant Chen says you have progressed from liability to merely inadequate, which from him is high praise. Captain Wolf believes you will survive your first real combat if you remember your training and get lucky. Colonel Cade thinks you have genuine talent for tactical analysis that should be developed further. Dr. Marsh wants to keep you in the medical corps permanently." "And what do you think, sir?" Sarah asked. "I think you are exactly what this war needs," Thorne replied. "Someone who can think like a soldier and feel like a human, who understands both tactical necessity and ethical imperative. Someone who will question orders that need questioning while following the ones that matter." He slid the folder across the desk. "Congratulations, Lieutenant Seraphina. You have completed your initial training phase and are hereby assigned to the Intelligence and Tactical Planning Division under Colonel Cade's direct supervision." Sarah opened the folder, seeing official documentation of her new assignment, along with commendation for performance during the ambush operation. "Thank you, sir. I will not disappoint you." "You already have not disappointed me," Thorne said. "Everything else is simply proving what I already knew." He stood, moving to the window that overlooked the compound. 3 weeks ago, you were refugee facing death from exposure. Today, you are officer with legitimate skills and earned respect. That transformation did not happen because of prophecy or genetic markers or anything mystical. It happened because you chose to be more than circumstances tried to make you. Sarah joined him at the window, looking out over the compound that had become home. "What happens now, sir?" "Now you continue training, but with more focus on your specific strengths," Thorne replied. "Cade will teach you intelligence analysis and strategic planning. Marsh will develop your medical expertise to field surgeon level. And I will teach you the most important skill any officer can possess, the ability to make hard decisions and live with their consequences." "That sounds ominous, sir." "It is," Thorne agreed. "Command is burden that weighs heavier with every decision. You will send people into danger knowing some will not return. You will prioritize missions over individuals. You will make choices that haunt you for the rest of your life." He turned to face her. "But you will also save lives that would otherwise be lost. Prevent conflicts that would otherwise escalate. Create space for peace to grow in landscape devastated by war. That burden and that possibility, they are two sides of same coin." "I understand, sir," Sarah said, though she suspected true understanding would only come with experience. "Dismissed, Lieutenant," Thorne said. "Get some rest. Tomorrow your real education begins." Sarah saluted and turned to leave, but Thorne's voice stopped her at the door. "Seraphina, one more thing." "Yes, sir?" "Your grandmother saved my life 17 years ago. She taught me that the strongest armies are built on voluntary commitment rather than forced compliance. She showed me that compassion and tactical effectiveness are not mutually exclusive." He met her eyes steadily. "I am honored to have the chance to pass those lessons to her granddaughter. Thank you for trusting me with that responsibility." The words hit with unexpected emotional force, acknowledgement and promise wrapped together. "Thank you for being worthy of that trust, sir." That evening, Sarah sat in her quarters reviewing the day's events with mind that felt simultaneously exhausted and energized. She had learned her father's identity, survived an ambush operation, and helped broker peace between opposing forces. More importantly, she had proven to herself and everyone watching that she belonged here not because of genetic markers or prophecy, but because of choices she made and skills she developed. The photograph of her mother sat on her desk, Catherine Whitmore's smile a reminder of heritage Sarah had never known she carried. Beside it, her grandmother's pendant caught the lamplight, the silver circle that had protected her for 22 years, now simply a memento of woman who had given everything to ensure Sarah would survive long enough to find her own path. A knock at her door interrupted her reflection. "Come in," she called. Colonel Cade entered, carrying a bottle and 2 glasses. "Thought you might need this," she said, holding up the whiskey. "It has been one hell of a day." "That it has, ma'am," Sarah agreed. Cade poured 2 generous measures and handed one to Sarah. "To surviving impossible situations," she toasted. "To finding where we belong," Sarah replied, and they drank. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, 2 soldiers processing trauma and triumph with the only medicine that sometimes helped. Finally, Cade spoke, her voice uncharacteristically gentle. "You did well today, Lieutenant. Better than well. You held position under pressure, gathered critical intelligence, and helped defuse situation that could have become bloodbath. The general made right call giving you that commission." "Thank you, Colonel. That means a lot coming from you." Cade smiled slightly. 3 weeks ago I thought you were charity case that would wash out within days. I was wrong. You are going to be good officer, Seraphina. Maybe great one, if you survive long enough to develop your potential. "I plan to survive," Sarah said. "I have too much to prove and too many people to prove wrong." "Good attitude," Cade approved. She refilled both glasses. "Tomorrow you start working with me full-time on intelligence analysis. Fair warning, it is different kind of difficult than physical training. You will see casualty reports and intelligence assessments that make you question whether any of this is worth fighting for. You will make recommendations that get people killed even when you make the right call. And you will learn to live with that burden because the alternative is letting someone less competent make worse decisions." "Understood, ma'am," Sarah said, "though I suspect understanding and accepting are 2 different things." "They are," Cade confirmed, "and the gap between them never fully closes." She raised her glass one more time. "But we do it anyway, because someone has to stand between chaos and everything worth protecting." "Welcome to the real work, Lieutenant." They drank to that grim truth, 2 officers acknowledging the weight they had chosen to carry and the reasons that made it worthwhile despite the cost. 3 months later, Sarah stood in the command center, reviewing intelligence reports that suggested coalition forces were repositioning for major offensive. She had grown into her role with confidence born of competence, her tactical recommendations earning respect from officers who had initially been skeptical. The halfling abilities that had once seemed like curse had become valuable asset. Her capacity to maintain partial shift while analyzing complex data, giving her unique perspective on battlefield dynamics. Thorne watched her work with expression that held satisfaction and something warmer that neither of them had acknowledged aloud. The professional boundaries remained, commander and subordinate, but beneath those boundaries something else was growing. Partnership built on mutual respect and shared purpose, foundation that might someday support more if circumstances allowed. For now, there was work. Always work. Endless analysis and planning and preparation for conflicts that might be prevented or might escalate beyond control. But Sarah faced it with certainty that had been absent from her life before. She belonged here. She had value here. She was becoming exactly what she needed to be, not in spite of her differences, but because of them. The Northern Command was her pack now, these soldiers her family, this endless war her purpose until peace could be won or negotiated or forced into existence through determination and sacrifice. And somewhere in Grey March territories, a father she barely knew wrote letters telling stories of a mother she would never meet, building a bridge across years of necessary lies toward relationship they both hoped might someday heal. "Trust your instincts," her grandmother had said. "They are stronger than you know." Alara had been right. Sarah's instincts had led her to that cave during the storm, had pushed her to share her last meal with wounded soldiers, had guided her to choose Northern Command over forced rescue, had helped her see that strength came in many forms and that the most valuable warriors were often those the world tried to discard. She was not defective. She never had been. She was simply different. And in a world that desperately needed new solutions to old problems, different was exactly what the future required.